Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first debate of term. The motion before the House tonight is this House would abolish private schools. Side-chairing me today is Jess, Ivan, Leonas taking the minutes, and many thanks to both Shifra and Sam who convened this debate. We're now going to move in terms of the speakers. We have Brett Wigdortz, Callan McDonald, and Lewis Uru on the proposition. And on the opposition, we have Julie Robinson, Gareth Parker-Jones, and Helen Pike. We're now going to move to quick reminder, because we've got many new faces here today, on the rules of decorum in debating. Speeches last 10 minutes. You are free to ask a speaker a point of information, but they are also free to reject you. So if the speaker does not want to take your point of information, they do not have to take it. But if you want a point of information, if there's something that you think isn't right or you'd like to challenge them on, stick your hand up nice and high and clear and say point of information, and the speaker can accept or reject. In between the rounds of speeches, you'll get the opportunity for floor speeches. These are 2-minute interventions. It could be on proposition, opposition, or abstention on the motion. So, without any further delay, we turn now to the first speaker of the proposition, Brett Wigdortz. Brett Wigdortz OBE is the co-founder and CEO of Tiny.co. He also wrote the original business plan for Teach First and led the organization for 15 years. He is also the co-founder and was deputy CEO of Teach for All, which has brought the model to over 50 countries across the world. Brett, you have the ears of the House.
Do I stand up there? Great. Well, first of all, it's wonderful to see such a great crowd here on this issue. I would just start by saying I've been very lucky to be in education now for about 25 years. And during that time, I've visited hundreds and hundreds of amazing schools throughout Britain and throughout the world. Some private schools, some state schools, many outstanding. And I want to start by saying we don't want to abolish private schools. We want to abolish the private part of private schools. There's some wonderful private schools out there that should have access to everyone. They should continue as schools. The question we have is, should they be private schools? And I think what we're all going to talk about today is why they shouldn't be private schools. They should be schools and not private schools. I think of some of the best schools I've seen around the world. I also think probably the best school I ever saw around the world was in a slum in Mumbai, taught by some Teach for India teachers, led by a Teach First head teacher, dirt floor, dirt walls, very little electronics, but the most amazing values. They worked on Gandhi's values in that school, and those kids were amazing. They would wipe the floor with any debater in this room. Amazing children from low-income backgrounds who had access to outstanding teaching, outstanding leadership, and the most amazing values of the school. And that's what every child should have. And I think we all should agree, every child should have access to that, whether in India, whether in England, whether in any country in the world. And I would go further to say it's an actual civil right. It's a civil right to say some children should access a great education, while other children, we don't need to access a great education. It's a civil right of every young person to access a world-class education. And as long as some children do and some children don't, that's a major problem with society. So what would we do if we were to abolish private part of private schools? We would begin phasing out fee-paying schools over the years. We would allow future cohorts of children to be allocated to school in a much larger catchment area. We would set up systems around the country to ensure that wealthy students were split in many different schools, and ensure that every school had access to a wide range of children and access to the resources and the leadership they needed to be truly outstanding. We wouldn't abolish the actual schools. Eton would still exist. What we would say is it should become an academy. It should continue to have the freedoms like academies have, but instead it should be open to all. And it shouldn't be open to just a little subset of young people who just access it because of the wealth of their parents. Now, there's a few reasons the other side may say this is inappropriate, and we were thinking of 4. I'm going to talk about 2, and Lewis and my co-debaters are going to talk about the other 2. First is that this is an issue of freedom, the freedom of parents to choose what's best for their children. I'm going to talk about that. The second is that state schools are failing, therefore there needs to be other options for children and young people to get away from this failing state sector. I've been to lots of schools. I know a lot about the system. Let me just tell you that's not true. I'm going to talk more about that. The third is the existence of private schools doesn't have a negative impact on the state sector or society at large. It's actually this nice neutral thing, nice on the side, and there's no problem. And actually, it's great because it means that the state doesn't have to educate these kids. It saves us money. We're going to prove that that is absolutely not true. And the fourth reason they might give is, no, state schools do lots of great things, even as they're private and they only open to children who have wealthy parents. They do bursaries, they do partnerships. They might put this lovely person on their governing board who comes from a low-income background. We're going to show that most of this is window dressing, and that most of this has very little positive effect on the wider sector. So the main question we have to answer is, do we believe education should be about ability and potential, or should education be about the wealth of your parents? And that's the question that we're going to try to get to today. And I think what we ask is, if we had a blank slate and we just set our education system from scratch, would we set up in a way where we had some children that only wealthy kids went to, some schools that only wealthy kids went to, and other schools that were open to everyone? Is that how we would set up from scratch? And we think that's a pretty obvious answer. Now, around parental choice and freedom, freedom is a really sacred thing. It's sacred in England, and it's sacred in many countries around the world. However, freedom can conflict. What one person does with their freedom can create unfreedoms for others, and there's many discussions around this. What is the extent of anyone's freedom? You know, I can have freedom to go into your garden, but if you own that garden, you have the freedom to own that garden. What we've seen is freedom is meaningless if it's out of reach. And excessive parental choice exacerbates education inequalities by creating resource disparities between schools. Promoting social good requires redistributing resources to ensure every child has the freedom to succeed. Not just some children, but every child has that freedom. Parental choice can only exist within a regulated system that prioritizes fairness, because then everyone has that freedom, and their children have the freedom to then become the most of what they inside can become. Because you can only make the most of yourself if you have access to that outstanding education, which is why it's such a civil right. If we don't allow parents to opt out of education completely, we don't allow parents to refuse any medical intervention on behalf of their children. There's many things we don't allow parents to do. We don't allow parents to endanger their children in all sorts of ways. So we can make it a public right and a public good for children to be educated together and children to all have access to a great state education. So I don't think freedom's a good argument here, because there's lots of ways we reduce some people's freedom in order to add freedom to everyone else in society. The other thing we could talk about is the benefits of private education. You know, is it really important that some children who have wealthy parents and have lots of money in their pocket can get out of this failing state sector? I mean, that's a complete myth, first of all. England has a fantastic state sector. Many of us don't realize just how good the state sector is in England. It's one of the best in the world. It's risen up the international PISA rankings, so it's now one of the best systems in the entire world. London is now considered one of the best cities in the entire world for low-income children to go into schools. What we've seen is private schools perpetuate social inequalities by providing privileged access to resources and networks unavailable to the majority, and the disparity reflects wealth rather than ability. And there's been lots of studies around this, and I found 3. There was this Taylor and Francis study which shows that the outcomes of selective versus non-selective schools are insignificant. They don't make a difference academically. Very modest findings indicate that attending an academically selective school does not pay off in academic benefits for individuals. The Times Education Supplement ran research from a DFE advisor, Tom Richmond, which compared A-level value-added scores of independent versus state schools, and said the value-added score for the 10 highest-performing independent schools was 0.19, and for the 10 highest-attaining non-selective state schools, 0.28. The report went further and also compared the top 20 private versus state schools and the top 50 and found no difference. So what we've seen in England is state schools add more value, or at least as much value as private schools. Sure, go ahead.
So if the state sector is so phenomenal, so wonderful in this country, that whose civil rights are being violated by having to go to those schools as opposed to having private schools? And one other point I would just ask is, would you entertain the argument at all that private schools, by not being a part of a national curriculum, national apparatus, provide an interesting experimental basis, an interesting point of diversity to test out educational innovation?
Well, I'd say for your second point, I totally agree, which is why I'm massively in favor of the academy system and the free school system and keeping private schools going where they can continue all their innovation. You know, Eton can continue playing their ball game. They could all do whatever they want to do, right? But they do it in the state sector, and those freedoms are incredibly important. I'm a huge proponent of schools having that freedom. For your first point, I'm going to get to that point, but I want to repeat that once all factors are controlled for, and Dylan Williams, professor of Institute of Education, made this point also, state schools do no worse than private schools in terms of value added, that this has been confirmed by many, many educational researchers. The understanding that private school education is better than the state school is a normative statement, is the other point I'd make. What does education mean? Is education about getting 3 A stars at A level, or is it about learning how to exist in society, how to be part of a global world, how to work with other types of people? That's also part of education, rather than being part of a social enclave. So private schools don't add more value, and I could point to lots of schools in England that are truly outstanding low-income state schools. I know Lewis went to one, like other ones I've seen are some of the best in the world. I've seen others around the world. You know, why do parents send their kids to private schools? Why do they spend hundreds of thousands if we know the value added academically is very, very small, if not negative? You know, it's a real question. Why would parents spend this money to send their kids to private schools? And it's really obvious, because private schools actually buy not a great education, but more a good network, and what's perceived to be being part of a good or appropriate peer group. And this is where we really get to what private schools are about. Elite schools disproportionately dominate access to top universities and profession because of this eliteness, because they separate people from society. Parents are paying for their children to be part of this elite group, separate from society, who can then perpetuate that elite. This concentration of power undermines meritocracy and fosters distrust in institutions. As an American, I'm actually disgusted what's happened this week in America, but that's what happens, that sort of revolution, when people don't trust institutions. And that's what private schools lead to. Private schools lead to distrust of institutions because they know that there's a group of young people and soon-to-be adults who don't mix with the rest of society. So that their children hang out with the right sort of people. Private schools segregate children based on wealth, exacerbating social divisions. Abolishing private schools would ensure all children are educated in a unified system, leveling the playing field. This would foster greater understanding and shared values across all socioeconomic groups, making children from diverse backgrounds, enriching educational experience, and teaching mutual respect. And I would just conclude by saying then, democracies thrive when leadership reflects the diversity of the population. Democracies thrive when diverse leadership, improved representation is throughout decision-making. Democracies don't thrive when a small group of individuals are exited from society, given an education separate from everyone else, and then pushed into leadership roles because of who they know. I will now go.